I'm 29 years old, I live in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and last year my girlfriend Megan and I agreed to take care of a ranch owned by someone she knew while he and his wife traveled for 2 weeks. The property was very remote, almost 40 minutes from the nearest paved road, just dirt road and open pasture all around. I work remotely in technical support so I could bring my laptop, and Megan was on vacation from college that week. The idea was simple. Feed the horses, check the barn, keep the house occupied, and basically make sure nothing was out of place. We arrived there on a Friday afternoon. The wind was constant, that dry Wyoming wind making noise against the metal sheets of the barn and lifting fine dust off the ground. The house was single-story, wooden, with a wide front porch and a long fence outlining the property. There were no visible neighbors, just open land as far as you could see. Cell service was weak, almost non-existent inside the house. The owners had left an old landline phone in the kitchen, saying it worked through a ground line and was more reliable there. At first it felt almost too quiet, silent in a way that was slightly unsettling, but nothing I didn't consider normal for a rural area. That first night, after feeding the animals and personally closing the main gate, I clearly remember pushing the heavy iron until the latch clicked into place. We went inside and locked all the doors. We made something simple for dinner and sat on the living room couch, which faced the front of the property through a large window. It was already after 9 p.m., and the sky was completely dark. No streetlights, just stars. At one point, Megan commented that she saw a different kind of glow near the far fence line. I stood up thinking it was her imagination, but when I approached the window, I clearly saw 2 points of light aligned low to the ground, like car headlights, parked beyond the fence, maybe about 200 meters from the house. You couldn't hear an engine because of the wind, but the lights were on and steady, facing the property. I stood there for a few seconds trying to understand if someone was lost or some distant neighbor, but remembering there were no visible neighbors for miles. The car didn't approach, didn't flash its lights, didn't do anything. It just stayed there. The feeling was strange at the time, but I was still trying to rationalize it, thinking maybe someone was stopped on the dirt road. The lights remained there for at least an hour. I know because I kept checking the microwave clock in the kitchen from time to time, trying to act like I wasn't worried. Megan was clearly nervous, pacing back and forth and asking if we should turn on all the exterior lights. I turned on the porch light, but it didn't make much difference because the distance was too great. At some moments, it seemed like the lights dimmed slightly, as if someone had adjusted the dashboard, but the vehicle never approached the fence. I opened the front door once to try to hear better, and the air was freezing, that dry cold that burns slightly inside your nose. I didn't hear an engine, didn't hear a door slam, didn't hear voices, just the wind crossing the field and the distant sound of metal creaking on the barn. When I went back inside, I closed and locked the door harder than necessary. I tried telling Megan it could just be someone stopped there looking at a map or dealing with something on their phone, even though I knew there was almost no signal in that area. Deep down, I already had a bad feeling, like it wasn't random. Around 10:30 p.m., the lights simply went out. There was no sound of a car pulling away, no headlights moving sideways. They just went dark suddenly, as if someone had turned off the vehicle and remained there in the dark. That's what truly made me uncomfortable. It was almost worse not seeing anything anymore. We stayed silent for a few minutes, staring at the same spot, trying to detect any movement. Megan asked if I thought we should call the owners, but I still didn't want to seem paranoid. Then we heard a metallic sound coming from the direction of the main gate. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. That specific sound of iron hitting iron. My stomach literally tightened instantly. I knew exactly what that sound was because I had closed the gate earlier. I stood still for a few seconds trying to convince myself it could be the wind, but the wind doesn't lift a latch by itself. I looked at Megan and realized she had recognized the sound too. I grabbed a flashlight hanging near the back door and stood there for a few seconds, deciding whether I should really go outside. Megan asked me not to, said it wasn't worth it, but at the same time the idea of leaving the gate open bothered me. If any animal got out, it would be our responsibility. I opened the door carefully and felt the air even colder than before, the wind hitting my face directly. The darkness outside was total, unlike any city. The only light came from the porch behind me. I walked a few steps over the gravel, hearing the sound of my own feet and the distant metal creaking from the barn. When I shined the flashlight toward the gate, I saw it was truly open, wide open, the latch hanging to the side. It wasn't just poorly secured. It was open as if someone had pulled it. I stood there trying to hear anything beyond the wind, any breathing, any footsteps. I heard nothing. The field seemed empty, but too empty. I closed the gate again, this time checking the latch twice, pushing hard until I felt it firmly locked. While doing that, I had the sensation of being watched, not from close range, but from somewhere farther away beyond the fence. It wasn't something I could prove, just a strange pressure in my chest and the constant urge to look over my shoulder. I scanned the area with the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the pasture and fence line, trying to catch any reflection of eyes or metal. Nothing. When I went back inside, I locked the door and turned the key twice. Megan was pale, sitting on the edge of the couch. That's when the landline phone in the kitchen started ringing. The loud sound in that silence made both of us practically jump. It wasn't a modern ringtone. It was that old, sharp, repetitive sound echoing throughout the entire house. The phone kept ringing for several seconds before I found the courage to answer. Each ring seemed louder than the last, reverberating in the empty kitchen. I looked at Megan and she just shook her head as if telling me not to answer. But at the same time, no one else should have been calling that number except the owners or someone who knew exactly where we were. When I lifted the receiver, my hand was cold and slightly sweaty. I said hello twice. On the other end, only silence. It wasn't the clean silence of a dropped line. I could hear very faint, irregular breathing, as if someone were holding their breath close to the phone. There was no strong static, no background noise, just that mute presence. I waited a few seconds and asked who it was. The breathing stopped. The line went completely silent and then disconnected. There was no loud click, just the feeling that the connection had vanished. I kept holding the receiver to my ear for a few seconds, trying to process it. When I put it back on the hook, I realized my heart was racing for real. That's when I decided to call the ranch owners. It took a while for the call to connect, as if the line were unstable. When they finally answered, I quickly explained about the car parked beyond the fence, the gate being opened, and now the strange phone call. I expected surprise or intense concern, but the response was strangely brief. The owner was silent for a second and then said only, "Do not confront anyone, just stay inside." His tone wasn't panicked, but it wasn't casual either. It sounded too controlled. I asked if they knew of anyone in the area who might be passing through or if they had ever had problems before. He said no and repeated almost the same sentence, telling us to stay inside the house and keep everything locked. The call ended quickly without many details. When I hung up, the feeling that remained wasn't relief. It was the sense that they knew more than they were saying. After I hung up, the house felt even quieter. The wind kept hitting the walls, but now every small sound made me turn my head. Megan and I went back to the living room window and stared into the dark field again, trying to see any movement. There were no more lights, nothing visible beyond the fence line fading into the darkness. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, just without headlights, without giving any sign. Megan suggested we turn off the interior lights so we wouldn't be so exposed. It made sense, so we left only the kitchen light on and turned everything else off. The living room was dim, lit only by a faint glow from behind. The house began to feel smaller, more closed in. I could hear the wood creaking, something normal in an old house, but at that moment everything sounded different. Louder. Closer. Around midnight, we decided we wouldn't actually sleep. We grabbed blankets and stayed on the couch, alternating between watching the window and checking the doors. At one point, I heard something that didn't sound like wind. It was a low sound, like footsteps on gravel, but distant, coming from the side of the house in the direction of the barn. I froze, trying to confirm it wasn't just my imagination. Megan heard it too because she grabbed my arm immediately. They weren't fast footsteps. They were slow, spaced out, like someone walking without any hurry. I felt that cold sensation crawl up my back. You couldn't see anything from that side window, so I moved to the other, narrower one that partially faced the path leading to the barn. The lighting was almost non-existent, but for a few seconds I thought I saw a shadow moving near the structure, something darker than the darkness itself. I couldn't say for certain, but it didn't feel like pure imagination either. I stood there at the window, forcing my eyes to adjust to the darkness. My eyes began to burn from staring at the same spot, searching for the slightest movement. Megan whispered, asking if I saw someone, and I said I wasn't sure, which was the truth. I didn't want to claim anything without seeing clearly, but I also couldn't ignore what seemed to have moved near the barn. The sound of footsteps on gravel happened again, this time a little closer to the side of the house. It wasn't constant like wind dragging something. It was weight. Weight distributed in intervals, with small pauses between each step. My whole body tensed as if waiting for something to hit the wall at any moment. My mouth felt dry and I had that strange metallic taste I get when I'm extremely anxious. I thought about calling the county police, but the idea of trying to explain something I couldn't clearly describe made me hesitate for a few seconds. That's when we heard a light tap on the exterior wall of the house. It wasn't a hard knock. It was something like 2 short taps, almost experimental, as if someone were testing whether anyone was awake inside. Megan held her breath immediately. I stayed completely still, trying to hear any breathing or whispering outside. The wind continued, but that tap had been different from any natural sound we'd heard so far. A few seconds later, there was another tap, slightly firmer, closer to the living room window. My heart started beating so hard I could feel it in my neck. I instinctively crouched down, pulling Megan with me so we wouldn't be visible through the glass. The faint kitchen light probably left us partially exposed. Then I heard something lightly scraping against the window glass, as if a fingernail or some object were being slowly dragged across the surface. The sound on the glass wasn't loud, but it was slow and deliberate. It didn't sound like a branch hitting it because there was no tree close enough to that window. It was as if someone were dragging the tip of something across the glass, making a thin, drawn-out noise that you could clearly hear in the silence of the room. I felt such a tightness in my chest that I had to take a deep breath to avoid panicking. Megan was genuinely shaking. I could feel her arm trembling against mine. We stayed crouched behind the couch, not daring to look directly at the window. The scraping stopped for a few seconds, and then I heard a faint clicking sound, as if someone had pressed their fingers against the glass. I couldn't hear breathing from outside, but that was what disturbed me most. Whoever was there wasn't making any real effort to hide completely, but also wasn't making enough noise to be identified. I slowly crawled to the kitchen and turned off the only light that was still on. The house went completely dark. The only illumination came from the faint starlight entering through the windows. We stayed in absolute silence, trying to make it seem like no one was inside. The scraping didn't return immediately, but the footsteps on the gravel reappeared, this time slowly moving away from the front of the house. They weren't running. They were controlled, as if the person was in no hurry at all. I mentally counted each interval between them until the sound disappeared again toward the direction of the barn. I waited a few minutes before moving. My body was stiff and my legs were starting to ache from crouching so long. That's when I heard something different, coming from the back of the property behind the barn. A short sound of an engine starting in the distance, followed by the noise of tires crushing gravel. Story 2. I am 23 years old and I live in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Last summer I got a temporary internship at an engineering company in a smaller city called Enid, a little over an hour from where I grew up. Since it was only for 3 months, I didn't want to sign a long lease, so I started looking for something cheap and temporary. I found an old apartment listed online, priced well below market value in an older building downtown. The owner said it was simple but functional, and that many students had stayed there for short periods. When I arrived, the building looked like it was from the 1970s. Narrow hallway, worn carpet, and a faint smell of cleaning product mixed with something older, slightly damp. It wasn't pretty, but it was quiet and close to my internship. I thought I was getting a good deal. I received the key in person from a real estate employee, signed basic paperwork, and went upstairs with my bags thinking it would just be a quiet summer focused on work. The apartment itself was small, a combined living room and kitchen, a bedroom separated by a thin door, and an old bathroom with light-colored tiles already yellowed by time. The front door lock looked new, which made me feel more at ease. A landline phone was installed on the kitchen wall, one of those simple white models with a coiled cord. I thought it was strange to still have a landline, but assumed it was just standard for the old building. The first night was normal. I organized my things, took a quick shower, and fell asleep exhausted after my first day at the internship. The building was so quiet that I could hear the refrigerator humming and my own footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. Nothing happened that night. I even thought I had been lucky to find such a quiet and cheap place. If I had known what would happen the following night, I probably would have left before even unpacking. On the second night, I got back later from the internship. I had stayed reviewing some reports and left the company after 8 p.m. The building was practically empty when I entered. The hallway had that weak yellowish lighting and the carpet muffled my steps. I didn't see any neighbors, didn't hear a television, nothing. Inside the apartment, everything was exactly as I had left it. I made something simple for dinner and spent some time on my laptop at the kitchen table. Around 10:30 p.m., I was already in bed, trying to sleep. The air conditioner made a low, constant noise. That's when I heard the doorknob being handled. At first I thought it was someone in the neighboring apartment, but I quickly realized it was coming from my door. It was the clear sound of a key being inserted into the lock. I froze in bed. I heard the metallic click of the key turning once, then another firmer attempt. The door didn't open because I had slid the internal latch, the metal bar you secure from inside. The person outside tried again, turning the key with more force, as if confused about not being able to enter. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. It wasn't someone knocking. It was someone trying to open the door with a legitimate key. After a few seconds, the attempt stopped. I stayed still, waiting to hear footsteps walking away down the hallway, but I heard nothing. The silence returned, heavy, as if no one had been there at all. I was still deciding whether to get up and look through the peephole when the landline phone in the kitchen began to ring. The ringing was so unexpected that it took me a few seconds to understand where the sound was coming from. It echoed through the small apartment, too loud for that hour. I walked slowly out of the bedroom, feeling the cold floor under my feet, and stood in the kitchen doorway staring at the phone as it rang. No one besides the real estate office and the landlord had that number. I answered on the fourth ring, my hand slightly trembling. I didn't say anything at first. On the other end, a male voice spoke calmly, almost politely. "You shouldn't be there." It wasn't aggressive. It was firm, direct. I immediately felt cold in my stomach. I asked who was speaking, but the person ignored the question and repeated, slightly lower, "That apartment isn't occupied." Before I could respond, the call was disconnected. I stood there holding the receiver for a few seconds after the line had already gone silent. My first reaction was to think it was some kind of bad joke. Maybe a neighbor trying to scare the newcomer, but that didn't explain the key in the door minutes earlier. I immediately called the landlord using the number on the contract. He answered after a few rings, sounding sleepy. I explained everything, the attempt to open the door with a key and the strange phone call. There was a pause on the other end. He asked for my full name and confirmed the apartment number. When I told him the number, he went silent for a few seconds that felt far too long. Then he said the apartment wasn't officially available for rent yet, and that there must have been some administrative error in releasing it. I felt a tightness in my chest instantly. I asked what he meant by error. He answered vaguely, saying he would check in the morning. His response didn't reassure me at all. I asked directly if anyone else had a key to that apartment. He said that technically only the real estate office and maintenance would have copies, but there was no reason for anyone to enter without notice. I mentioned that someone had clearly tried to open it with a key, and he repeated that it was probably an internal misunderstanding. The way he spoke seemed overly careful, as if he were choosing each word. Before hanging up, he told me to keep the door locked that night and that he would resolve everything in the morning. The call ended quickly. I stood in the kitchen staring at the front door as if it might move again at any moment. The apartment, which had seemed merely old before, now felt wrong. Too small, too enclosed. I couldn't sleep. I sat on the couch with all the lights off, trying to hear any movement in the hallway. At times I thought I heard muffled footsteps outside, but it could have been the building settling. Every small creak of wood made me hold my breath. I spent much of the early morning looking through the peephole. The hallway was empty, lit by the same faint yellowish light. No one standing there, no one walking. Even so, I had the feeling that someone believed that apartment was supposed to be empty. It didn't feel like a random break-in attempt. It felt like an interrupted routine. Around 4 a.m., exhaustion overtook me a little and I dozed off on the couch, but I woke up several times at the slightest noise. The next morning, when sunlight came through the blinds, I felt drained. I took a quick shower and decided to leave early for my internship. Before going downstairs, I stopped by the mailboxes on the ground floor. Each apartment had a small metal compartment with a name printed on a white label. I looked for my apartment number. The number was there, but the space where my name should have been was empty. All the others had last names printed or handwritten. Mine didn't. I stood there staring at it for a few seconds, feeling a strange discomfort. It was as if I didn't officially exist there, as if the system still considered that apartment vacant. While I was still standing there looking at the mailbox, I noticed something that made me even more uneasy. The door of my compartment was slightly dented near the lock, as if someone had forced it at some point. It wasn't open, but it didn't look intact like the others. I ran my finger over the metal and felt a rough edge, recent without accumulated dust. It didn't look like old damage. I looked around the building lobby. There was no one there, just the faint smell of cleaning product and the distant sound of plumbing. That's when I noticed the resident list posted on a board near the entrance also didn't have my name. My apartment number was listed as available. I felt pressure in my chest immediately. If someone believed that place was empty, then the attempt the previous night might not have been a mistake. I left the building feeling constantly watched. The side parking lot had few occupied spaces, and I tried to mentally identify which cars had been there the previous night. There was no way to know. During the day at the internship, I could barely concentrate. I kept replaying in my head the sound of the key turning in the door and the voice on the phone saying I shouldn't be there. It didn't feel like a direct threat. It felt like a warning. Around noon, I called the landlord again, asking for a clearer explanation. He said he was checking with management and that I didn't need to worry. His vagueness irritated me. I asked if someone could still have an old key to that apartment. He said theoretically no, but he didn't sound convinced. That made me even more tense because it meant there was a real possibility someone could enter, if I forgot the internal latch. When I returned to the building in the late afternoon before going upstairs, I went straight to the real estate office 2 blocks away. I explained everything in person. The receptionist looked confused while checking the system. She typed for a while and frowned. She said that apartment was marked as off-catalog pending structural review, something related to unfinished maintenance. I asked how I had managed to rent it. She said there had probably been an error in the online system, and that it shouldn't have been released for contract. The problem was that I had a signed contract. She asked me to wait while she spoke with the manager. I sat in a hard chair, feeling the same tightness in my stomach as the night before. The more answers I sought, the more it seemed no one wanted to clearly explain what was happening. In the end, the manager confirmed there had been a mistake, and that I could be relocated to another apartment in the building or another one of their properties. I asked if anyone besides management had a key to the unit. He hesitated before answering that he couldn't guarantee all old copies had been collected after the previous tenant. That was enough for me to decide I wouldn't spend another night there. I returned to the apartment as the sky was beginning to darken again and packed my belongings as quickly as possible. While putting my clothes into my suitcase, every small noise in the hallway made me stop and listen. There was no attempt with a key that night, but the feeling that someone expected that place to be empty remained strong. It didn't feel personal against me. It felt like I had occupied a space that someone believed was still available. I left before 8 p.m., taking my bags to the car and handing the key directly to the real estate office, demanding immediate cancellation. I never received a concrete explanation about what really happened. My name never appeared on the mailbox. To this day, what unsettles me most isn't the voice on the phone or the key turning in the lock. It's how natural it all felt, as if someone had simply followed a normal routine, trying to enter an apartment that had always been empty. And for 2 nights, without anyone officially knowing, I had been inside it. Story 3. I am 34 years old and I work as an elderly caregiver in a small town in rural Missouri, near Jefferson City. I've been doing this kind of work for almost 8 years, always assisting patients in their own homes. At the beginning of last year, I started caring for a man named Mr. Harlan, who lived alone in a single-story house in a very quiet neighborhood, full of old trees and wide streets. My shift was always from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. because he needed overnight supervision. Since the street in front of the house was narrow and poorly lit, I always parked in the same side spot, next to the white fence that separated his yard from the neighbors. It was a somewhat dark area, but it was close to the side door of the house, which made me feel safer when arriving at night. I am a person of routine, so practically every day I arrived at the same time, parked in the same place, locked my car, and entered through the same door. On the 3rd or 4th consecutive night of that shift, when I left at 7 a.m. to go home, I found a piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. At first, I thought it was an advertisement or some kind of notice from a neighbor. It was a small piece of white paper folded once. When I opened it, written by hand in blue ink, it said, "You always arrive at 19 WM." The handwriting was firm, steady, as if it had been written calmly. My stomach tightened instantly. I stood there staring at it for a few seconds, trying to understand if it could be some kind of bad joke. There was no name, no explicit threat, nothing beyond that simple sentence. I looked around the street. It was early, still dim, just a few birds and no visible people. The neighborhood seemed too normal for something like that. I crumpled the paper and threw it onto the passenger seat, trying to convince myself it might just be someone overly observant or a strange neighbor. That morning I drove home trying to rationalize it. Maybe some teenager in the neighborhood thought it was funny to notice my routine. Maybe it was just someone bored. The problem was that the sentence didn't sound like a joke. There was no exclamation mark, no tone, just a direct statement. I didn't tell anyone that day. I went back for my shift that same night at 7 p.m., as always. I parked in the same place even with a slight discomfort in my chest. I sat inside the car for a few seconds before getting out, watching through the rearview mirror, trying to see if anyone was observing me from a window. Nothing looked different. The street was silent as usual, with the weak lighting from old street lamps. I went inside and tried to forget about it. Mr. Harlan was watching television and the night routine was normal. During the following week, I started noticing a car parked across the street, almost in front of the house, but a few meters ahead. It was a dark sedan, probably blue or black. It was hard to tell under the poor lighting. It always appeared after I arrived. At first, I assumed it belonged to a neighbor, but I began paying attention to details. The car wasn't there when I arrived at 7 p.m. It showed up about 20 or 30 minutes later. It would remain parked with its lights off, apparently empty. You couldn't clearly see anyone because of the reflection from the street lights on the body of the car. On 2 consecutive nights when I went to the kitchen to get something and looked out the side window, the car was still there, unmoving. That's when it truly started bothering me. It wasn't just the note. It was the pattern. On the 6th night of that week, I was already much more alert. Before even leaving home for my shift, I considered changing my arrival time just to test it. But I ended up going at the usual time. When I parked in the side spot, the street looked empty like on the other days. I went inside, organized Mr. Harlan's medications, and tried to act normal. Around 7:40 p.m., I went to the living room window and pulled the curtain just enough to see the street. The sedan was there again, parked across the street, aligned almost exactly like on previous nights. My heart started racing immediately. It wasn't a coincidence. I began noticing details I hadn't before. The windows were slightly tinted, and the car was parked in an area where almost no one left a vehicle because it was in front of a vacant house. That same night, around 11 p.m., I needed to go out to my car to get a coat I had left in the back seat. I stood for a few seconds at the side door of the house, observing the street before crossing the small patch of grass to my parking spot. The sedan was still there, completely motionless. No interior light was on, no face visible. I walked to my car, feeling the skin on my arms prickle from the cold wind and the sensation of being watched. I opened the door, grabbed the coat, and when I closed it, I decided to look directly at the sedan, as if challenging whoever was inside to react. Nothing happened. The car didn't move. I went back inside, but the discomfort grew. It didn't seem like someone visiting a neighbor. It seemed like someone waiting. The following week, I decided to test something. Instead of leaving exactly at 7 a.m., as I did every day, I ended my shift half an hour early, around 6:30 a.m. I wanted to see if the car would be there at that time as well, or if its presence was only at night. When I looked through the window before leaving, it was still dark, that deep blue sky before sunrise. The sedan was not in its usual position. For a moment, I felt relief, thinking maybe it had truly been coincidence and I had been overreacting. I grabbed my bag, said goodbye to Mr. Harlan, who was still asleep, and left through the side door as usual. The morning air was cold and damp, different from the dry night air. I walked to my car, trying to stay calm. As soon as I unlocked my car and opened the door, I heard the sound of an engine starting behind me. It was immediate, as if the person had been waiting for a signal. I slowly turned my head and saw the same sedan, now parked a bit farther down the street, partially hidden by the shadow of a large tree. The headlights turned on at the exact moment I sat in the driver's seat. It was too automatic to be coincidence. My heart began pounding so hard I could feel the pulse in my hands as I tried to put the key in the ignition. I didn't wait to see what would happen. I started the car and drove off, almost accelerating too hard. In the rearview mirror, I saw the sedan begin to move a few seconds later, maintaining a constant distance behind me. I tried to convince myself it could just be someone leaving for work at the same time. But the exact distance the car kept behind mine made me uneasy. It wasn't too close, and it wasn't too far. It was as if it didn't want to draw attention, but also didn't want to lose sight of me. I made a turn I normally wouldn't take to go home, entering a narrower residential street. The sedan made the same turn seconds later. My stomach dropped immediately. I began breathing faster and felt my hands sweating on the steering wheel. I didn't want to accelerate too much to avoid seeming desperate, but I also didn't want to give it a chance to get closer. I drove toward a busier avenue in town, where there were already more cars and an open gas station. As soon as I pulled into the well-lit gas station area, the sedan continued straight and disappeared. That afternoon, I called the local police. I explained about the note, the car parked every night, and what had happened that morning. The dispatcher was polite but practical. He asked if I had written down the license plate. I hadn't been able to see it. He asked if there was a direct threat in the note. I said no, just the sentence about my schedule. He said they could register it as suspicious activity, but without a plate number or detailed driver description, it was difficult to take action. Even so, a patrol car drove down Mr. Harlan's street that night. I felt slightly more at ease, but only slightly. The problem was that my routine remained the same and I still had to work there. The next day I decided to completely change my pattern. Instead of parking in the side spot, I drove around the block and parked 2 streets behind near a small church that was closed at night. I walked to the patient's house by a different route, trying to appear casual. During the shift, I kept checking the side window from time to time. For almost an hour, I saw nothing unusual. I began thinking maybe the change had worked. But around 8 p.m., while I was in the kitchen preparing Mr. Harlan's dinner, I looked out the front window and saw the same sedan slowly driving down the main street. It slowed near the house as if searching for something. A few minutes later, I heard the sound of an engine turning off. I went to the side window facing the back street. The sedan was parked there just a few meters from where I had left my car. It was a different street, but it had reappeared. There was no way that was coincidence. I felt my blood run cold. It had nothing to do with the patient, because no one besides me knew I had changed my parking spot that day. The police never managed to identify the vehicle. No plate was ever recorded. There was never a direct confrontation. After a few more days living under that constant tension, I requested to be transferred from that case. To this day, what scares me most is that the person showed no interest in the house or the patient. They were interested in me, and they knew exactly where to find me. Story 4. I am 31 years old and I work the night shift at a small family-owned motel near a secondary highway in northern Nevada, about 40 minutes from the nearest larger city. It's winter here, so after 8 p.m., almost no one shows up. Most of the guests are truck drivers or travelers passing through. The building is old, shaped like a U, with rooms arranged around an open parking lot in the center. The reception is at the front with a thick glass window facing the parking lot. During my shift from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., I am completely alone. There is no security, no other employee. Just me, the front desk computer, the security cameras, and the internal phone that connects the rooms to the front office. That night was especially quiet. The air was dry and cold, and the wind made a constant noise hitting the metal panels along the exterior walkway roof. I had already done a partial cash count and was watching something quietly on my phone when I received a notification of a new online reservation. The reservation had been made literally 3 minutes before the car entered the parking lot. That's already unusual, because most online bookings are made hours in advance. The car entered slowly, its headlights illuminating the motel facade for a few seconds before parking. It was a light gray sedan, a common model, nothing flashy. The man got out alone. He didn't look drunk or disoriented. He walked calmly, but observing everything around him. I noticed that on the cameras before he even entered reception. He looked toward the side corridors, toward the back of the building, as if trying to memorize the layout of the rooms. When he entered, I felt the cold air come in with him. He specifically asked for the room farthest from the reception, the last one on the right corner of the U. He said he preferred more quiet. His tone was normal, but the way his eyes kept moving across the layout behind me made me uncomfortable. While I pulled up the reservation in the system, I tried to act as usual, that automatic front desk mode. Confirm name, car plate, request ID. He gave a common name, something like Daniel Moore, and handed over a driver's license too quickly, like someone who doesn't want you looking at it for long. I can't explain it well, but it was a small detail. He held the document by the edge and pulled it back as soon as I typed the birth date. The photo looked like him, so I didn't have a real reason to question it, but my instincts were alert. Another strange thing was that he had no luggage, no backpack, no suitcase, nothing in his hands. I asked in the most neutral tone possible if he needed help with anything from the car, and he said, "No, I'm just passing through." But while saying that, he looked over my shoulder at the motel map posted on the wall, the one showing room numbers and where the laundry room, maintenance room, and storage are located. I saw his eyes following the lines of the map and pausing at the back of the building, as if mentally marking which doors led to the rear corridor. I printed the check-in paper and handed him the key to the farthest room because that's what he requested, but I felt a real discomfort doing it, as if I were giving access to a part of the motel I couldn't clearly see from reception. He thanked me without smiling, took the key, and before leaving asked where the ice machine was. I pointed it out, explaining that it was in the middle of the right corridor, under a light that sometimes flickers. He nodded, but he didn't go there. I saw on the camera that he went straight toward the corner, heading to the distant room, walking slowly, stopping once in the middle of the parking lot as if he were just listening to the surroundings. I waited a few minutes and tried to return to my work, but I couldn't stop checking the cameras. The monitor at reception has 4 quadrants: entrance, central parking lot, right corridor, and the rear area, which is a worse camera, with grainy image and heavy shadows. The back of the motel is the darkest area, where there are doors to vacant rooms, the locked laundry room, and an exit to a service alley. About 15 minutes after check-in, I saw the man again, but he wasn't going to the ice machine. He was in the back corridor, walking near the doors of the vacant rooms, and it wasn't the walk of a guest looking for his room. He stopped at each door for about 2 seconds, tilted his head and discreetly touched the doorknob just enough to test if it was locked. My stomach dropped instantly. I felt that rush of heat to my face like adrenaline, and my hands went cold on the mouse. I zoomed in digitally, even knowing the camera quality was poor, and saw him repeat it on 2 more doors. He didn't knock, didn't call out, didn't seem confused. It was a pattern. I started thinking about calling the police immediately, but I also worried about overreacting and causing trouble with a guest who might have some trivial explanation. At the same time, I was alone in an old building on a cold night, with a man walking where no guest should be walking. So I did what seemed safest at that moment. I called his room from the front desk internal phone, trying to keep my voice steady, as if it were just protocol. When he answered the internal phone, his voice sounded far too calm for someone who was supposedly just trying to settle into his room. I identified myself as the front desk employee and politely said that the cameras showed him walking around the rear area of the building, and that area was not intended for guests. There was a short pause on the other end, and then he replied, "I was looking for the ice machine." His tone was almost casual, as if I were exaggerating. I explained again where the ice machine was located, reinforcing that it was not in the back area. He stayed silent for 2 seconds and then said he must have gotten confused. The call ended without argument, but what unsettled me was that while I still had the phone in my hand, the camera showed him standing completely still in the back corridor, looking directly at the camera for a few seconds before turning and walking back toward his room. That didn't look like someone who was lost. It looked like someone who knew exactly where he was and knew he was being watched. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my neck. I took a few deep breaths, trying to stay calm. The wind outside kept hitting the metal structure, making that dry, repetitive noise, but now every sound felt amplified. I watched him enter his room and close the door. I waited a few more minutes, but something didn't add up. He had asked about the ice machine before even leaving reception. It made no sense to go to the opposite end of the building if I had clearly pointed out the correct direction. Besides, he wasn't carrying anything that would justify leaving the room so soon. I felt a growing pressure in my chest, a very clear intuition that this had nothing to do with ice or corridor confusion. I grabbed my personal phone and discreetly called the local police, explaining that a guest was testing the doors of vacant rooms. The dispatcher said they would send a patrol car to check, but since there was no confirmed crime, it might take a few minutes. I kept monitoring the cameras. About 5 minutes after the call, his room door opened again. He came out without hurry, looked both ways across the parking lot, and walked to his car. He wasn't carrying a bag, didn't return the key, didn't come to the reception desk. He simply got into the sedan and sat there for a few seconds with the engine running. I stood still behind the counter, watching through the camera and also through the front window. When he saw the lights of a patrol car turning onto the main road in the distance, his car left the parking lot immediately, even before the police officially entered the motel area. It was too fast to seem like coincidence. The patrol car arrived about a minute later and I explained everything in person. They took down the vehicle description, but since he hadn't forced any doors, there wasn't much they could do besides file a report. 2 days later, when the manager came to review the reservations, we discovered that the card used at check-in had been canceled a few minutes after the transaction. The name on the reservation did not match any valid document in the state system. It was a false identity. He never intended to stay in the room. He needed access, the key, the freedom to move around as a legitimate guest for a few minutes. Since that night, I have never again handed out the farthest room without double-checking everything. And I have never ignored that initial feeling when someone is observing the layout with too much interest, because it didn't seem like a customer looking for rest. It seemed like someone studying the building. Story 5. I am 17 years old and I live in a small town in rural Arkansas near Batesville. My dad owns a simple farm supply store on the side of a state highway, the kind that sells feed, seeds, fence parts, and basic tools. The building sits isolated, surrounded by open fields on both sides and a barbed wire fence marking the property line. There are no close neighbors, just pasture and a few trees farther out. Since I was 15, I've helped him close the store on Fridays, especially in the winter when it gets dark early and business drops off quickly after 6 p.m. That night was cold, a dry wind cutting across the field and lifting fine dust from the gravel parking lot. We had already locked the front doors, pulled down half of the metal security gate, and were inside counting the register like we always did before leaving. It was around 7:30 p.m. when my dad finished counting the money and told me to turn off the lights in the storage room. The only lighting left came from the fluorescent ceiling lights and a tall pole light in the parking lot that flickered occasionally. When I came back from the storage room, he was standing near the side window, looking outside. I asked what was wrong, thinking it might be a late customer. He just nodded for me to look. On the other side of the fence, about 30 or 40 meters from the store, there was a man standing in the field, completely still. He wasn't walking, wasn't on his phone, didn't look like he was passing through. He was just standing there, staring directly at the building. I felt that cold drop in my stomach immediately. I couldn't see his face clearly because of the distance and the weak light from the pole, but I could tell he was looking at us. My dad pulled the curtain back a little more and raised his hand, waving as if to ask whether the person needed help. The man didn't react, he didn't wave back, didn't turn away, he just stood there completely motionless. My dad is the kind of person who tries to explain everything in practical terms. He muttered something like, "Maybe he's just crazy," and gave a short laugh. But I could tell by the way he held the window that he was uncomfortable too. The first thing that came to my mind was, how did that guy get there? The store is set back, and if someone pulls over on the road, we usually see headlights. At that moment, there were no cars passing, no vehicle lights entering the parking lot. Just the dark field and that man on the other side of the fence. The wind made the barbed wire vibrate slightly, a thin, irritating sound, and the metal plates on the front gate creaked with the gusts. I remember smelling dust and old oil inside the store mixed with the smell of animal feed. The longer I stared at the man, the more I felt like he wasn't just standing there. It felt like he was waiting for a specific moment, like he had calculated our closing time. My dad told us to finish up and leave. He turned off the interior lights one by one, leaving only the front counter light on, and I went to check that the back door was locked. Everything inside the building seemed normal, but that man outside completely changed the feeling of the place. When I came back, my dad grabbed the keys and looked out the window one more time before going out. The man was still in the same spot. He hadn't moved closer, but he hadn't left either. My dad opened the side door leading to the parking lot, and the cold air hit our faces. The gravel was damp and crunched under our steps. I instinctively looked toward the fence as we walked toward the truck. The man was still there. I tried to see if he was holding anything, if he had a flashlight, but I couldn't tell. The darkness swallowed almost everything except his outline. When we reached the truck, my dad pressed the remote to unlock it, and I heard the click of the locks. That's when I noticed something was wrong. The rear tires were visibly low, not completely flat, but sunken enough to make the truck look like it was sitting too low in the back. I stopped immediately and felt a chill run through me. My dad saw it too. He muttered a curse under his breath and crouched down to take a closer look. The flashlight from his phone lit up the rubber, and it was obvious it wasn't just our imagination. Both rear tires were partially deflated, like someone had slowly let the air out. It didn't look like a blowout. It looked deliberate. My dad stood up quickly and looked toward the fence. I followed his gaze. The man was still there, standing, watching. This time my dad didn't wave. He just stared back, jaw tight. I started breathing faster without realizing it. The first thing I thought was that this couldn't be a coincidence. We had parked there at 8 a.m. and the tires were fine. No one had complained. No one had noticed anything strange during the day. And now, exactly when we were about to leave, both rear tires were low at the same time. My dad ran his hand through his hair, visibly trying to stay calm. He told me to get inside the truck and lock the door while he made a quick walk around the vehicle. I got into the passenger seat and felt the cold leather against me. I locked the door and watched through the side window. My dad crouched near the tire valves and shined his phone light on them. He didn't say anything for a few seconds, but I could see his shoulder tense. When he came back to the driver's door, he got in quickly and locked it too. He didn't start the engine right away. He just stared through the windshield toward the fence. I did the same. The man was still there, motionless, as if watching the whole thing. I had a very clear feeling that this had been planned. This wasn't someone passing by randomly. This was someone who knew we closed at that time. My dad picked up his phone and called a friend who lives about 10 minutes away, someone with a bigger truck and a portable air compressor. While the phone rang, I couldn't take my eyes off the figure beyond the fence. The wind seemed to calm down and the silence felt heavier. I realized the man was slightly closer to the fence than before, but still outside the property. I couldn't see his expression, just his straight posture and fixed stare. My dad spoke quietly to his friend, quickly explaining the situation without directly mentioning the man. He just said the tires were leaking and that he needed help. When he hung up, he took a deep breath and finally turned the key in the ignition. The engine made that familiar deep sound, and the headlights came on, lighting up the field ahead. That's when I saw something that made me swallow hard. The headlights hit exactly where the man was standing. For a second, I could see his face more clearly. He wasn't smiling. He didn't look aggressive. His expression was too neutral. And then, instead of stepping back toward the road, he simply turned his body and began walking into the dark field, away from the light. I followed him with my eyes as he moved away from the illuminated area. He didn't run. He didn't seem startled. He walked in a straight line into the field, as if he knew exactly where he was stepping despite the uneven ground. The truck's headlights only reached a few meters beyond the fence, and after that everything became shadow. Within seconds he was hard to distinguish. First he became a darker silhouette than the rest, then he practically disappeared. I kept staring, trying to catch any movement, but the field looked empty again. What bothered me most was that there was no sound of a car starting anywhere. If he had come by vehicle, it wasn't nearby. No headlights appeared on the road. Nothing. Just the open field and the wind picking up again. My dad put the truck into gear, but as soon as he tried to move, we could feel that the rear tires were too low to safely get on the highway. The vehicle rolled a few inches, and he stopped immediately. He took a deep breath and said it wasn't worth risking a blowout in the middle of the road. We sat there with the engine running, headlights illuminating the empty field, waiting for his friend to arrive. I kept watching the mirrors, the side of the fence, any point that might indicate someone was still nearby. The feeling was clear. Whoever it was didn't want to steal anything. There was no break-in at the store, no attempt to enter. The only thing altered were the tires, as if the goal had been to keep us from leaving at that specific moment. Time started to feel slower. Every minute inside the truck felt doubled. I could hear the engine vibrating lightly and the wind hitting the metal body. At one point I thought I saw something move deeper in the field, but it could have been my imagination racing. My dad kept his hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead, but I could tell he was alert to any movement. About 8 or 10 minutes later, we saw headlights approaching on the main road. It was his friend arriving. The extra headlights lit up part of the side field, and I waited to see if the man would reappear in the brighter light. There was no one. His friend parked beside us, and we got out quickly to explain what had happened. While his friend connected the portable compressor to fill the tires, my dad and I walked around the truck with our phone flashlights. That's when we saw something that confirmed what we already suspected. The valve caps from both rear tires were on the ground near the wheels. They hadn't simply fallen off. Someone had unscrewed them. There was no cut in the rubber, no visible nail. The air had been manually released. My dad picked up one of the caps from the ground and stared at it in his palm in silence. Nothing had been stolen from the store, nothing was broken. But someone had been close enough to mess with the valves in the dark while we were inside counting the register. And he had stayed on the other side of the fence waiting to see what would happen. That night we managed to leave after filling the tires, but my dad made sure to take a longer route before getting onto the main highway, just to make sure no one was following. We never found out who that man was. There was no exterior camera pointing toward the field, only toward the parking lot. What stayed with me the most wasn't him disappearing into the darkness. It was realizing that someone had calculated our schedule, entered the property unnoticed, and done something simple and silent that could have left us stuck there for much longer if we hadn't called for help. To this day, when I help my dad close the store, I look beyond the fence before even turning off the lights. Story 6. I am 26 years old and I do delivery app work here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, mostly during the late night shift because it pays a little better, and traffic is almost non-existent. I live in the western part of the city and usually drive around more remote residential neighborhoods and some commercial areas that stay open late. That night was a cold Tuesday around 1:40 a.m., and I had already been driving for a few hours. Business was pretty slow. I was starting to consider logging off when a delivery request came in from a 24-hour restaurant near Central Avenue. Nothing unusual. The payout was reasonable, and the destination showed a residential neighborhood farther out, near the edge of the city, almost heading toward the desert highway. I accepted it because it was going to be the last run I planned to do before heading home. I picked up the order without any issues. It was a small bag, nothing heavy, apparently just simple food. The address in the app looked normal, just a typical residential street. I had done deliveries in that area before, but not exactly on that street. As I drove, I noticed the neighborhood getting quieter and quieter. The houses were spaced apart, many with large yards and very little street lighting. It was the kind of area where, after midnight, you barely see anyone outside. When I turned onto the indicated street, I noticed something strange right away. The house at the address was completely dark. There were no lights on inside, none on the porch, and there were 2 large for sale signs planted in the front yard. I pulled over to the curb on the opposite side, angling my headlights slightly so I wouldn't fully light up the entire house, and stared at it for a few seconds to make sure I was in the right place. I checked the house number on the curb in the mailbox. It matched the app. Still, it didn't look like a house with someone awake waiting for food at almost 2 a.m. The lawn was slightly overgrown, like a vacant house, and it had that still look. No car in the driveway, no trash bins out, no TV light leaking through a window. I felt a small sense of discomfort but tried to stay calm. Sometimes people stay in the back house, or it's a temporary rental, or someone is staying there and doesn't want to turn on lights. I grabbed the bag from the passenger seat and before getting out, opened the app to mark arrived. That's when a message from the customer came in very quickly without a greeting or anything. Park behind the house so you don't wake the neighbors. Deliver to the back door. I read it twice. That wasn't typical for the app. Usually instructions like that are added beforehand, and even then it's usually leave at the front door. Behind the house, in a dark place, with a for sale sign, on an empty street at 1:50 a.m. Didn't sound normal. I felt my body go on alert instantly, like heat in my chest and that tight feeling in my stomach. I replied in the app chat with something simple like, I can't go to the back. I'll leave it in front on the curb, and stayed in the car watching. I didn't want to get out and turn my back on the rest of the street without understanding what was happening. While I still had my phone in my hand, I saw movement near the side of the house. It was subtle, almost like a shadow passing, but I saw it. It wasn't a cat, because the shape was too tall and the movement was slow, controlled. I didn't see a face, just a dark silhouette shifting near the corner of the house, like someone trying to stay close to the wall to avoid the beam of my headlights. I immediately held my breath, trying to figure out if I was misinterpreting it. I leaned forward slightly over the steering wheel to get a better look. The movement stopped. I didn't see anything else, but I was sure someone was there, outside, near the back, out of reach of the light. The thought that crossed my mind was direct. The message asking me to go to the back wasn't about not waking the neighbors. It was to get me off the street, out of the light, and into a place where no one would see anything. I started thinking about canceling it myself, but before I could touch anything, the order was canceled. The app showed a notification like, "Order canceled by customer," and the screen reset as if it had never existed. It was too fast, like the cancellation had been triggered the second I refused to go to the back. I stared at my phone screen for a few seconds, half in disbelief. The cancellation removed the obligation of the delivery, but it also removed any sense of normalcy. If it were just someone confused, why cancel immediately after I said I wouldn't go behind the house? I looked again at the house and the for sale signs in the yard. No lights, no sign of life. Just the reflection of my headlights in the windows and the faint shine on the sign paint. I didn't get out of the car. I didn't unlock the door. I just sat there, hand on the gear shift, trying to decide whether to leave immediately or confirm with my own eyes that I hadn't imagined the silhouette. The rational part of my brain started inventing excuses. Maybe it was a realtor showing the house at a weird hour. Maybe someone was secretly staying there. Maybe the house wasn't really vacant. But none of that explained the specific instruction to go to the back, or the way that shadow moved trying to avoid the light. My throat felt dry, and I realized my jaw was clenched tight enough to hurt. I put the car in drive and started moving slowly, without accelerating hard. I didn't want to make noise, but I also didn't want to become a target if someone was watching. The street was narrow, with low trees and few streetlights. I drove about 20 meters and checked the rearview mirror, trying to see if anyone was stepping onto the sidewalk or toward the corner. Nothing. The house was behind me now, but I could still see the edge of the roof and the dark outline of the yard. That's when I noticed something else. On the right side of the street, a bit farther ahead, there was a car parked that I hadn't noticed when I arrived. And I'm almost sure it wasn't there before, because I usually scan the whole street before stopping. The car had its lights off, parked a few meters away, almost like it was waiting for someone. I couldn't see a license plate. In fact, that's what caught my attention. The rear looked too clean, without that rectangular reflection from a plate catching my headlights. As I drove past slowly, my headlights hit it from the side, and I saw there was no visible plate on the front either. I felt a cold sensation run through my entire body. That's not a common detail in a residential neighborhood at that hour. As I passed the car without plates, I tried not to turn my head, obviously. I just glanced from the corner of my eye and through the rearview mirror. The windows were too dark for that hour, heavily tinted. I couldn't see if anyone was inside. The engine seemed off because I didn't hear anything. But at that moment, I didn't fully trust my own perception. The street was too silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy. I felt a very clear urge to accelerate hard and get out of there as fast as possible. But I also thought that if I sped off, it might draw attention or provoke a reaction. So I kept a steady speed until I reached the corner. That's when I saw in the rearview mirror the car's headlights turn on for a second and then off again. Like someone testing the switch. My heart started racing. I turned right, and instead of taking the direct route home, I intentionally took a detour through streets I knew better, trying to see if it would follow me. I checked the mirror every 3 seconds. In the first block, nothing. In the second, nothing. I started thinking maybe I was overreacting. Maybe the car had already been there. Maybe the plate was just poorly lit and I hadn't seen it properly. My brain was trying to calm me down, but my body didn't agree. My shoulders were stiff and my breathing was short. When I reached a slightly more illuminated avenue with a 24-hour gas station on the corner, I deliberately slowed down to pull into the station. That's when I saw headlights appear behind me in the mirror. turning in the same direction I had just turned. I couldn't be 100% sure, but the timing and distance matched too closely. I pulled into the gas station and stopped near the entrance under the bright white lights. I stayed there with the engine running, pretending to look at my phone. A few seconds later, the car drove slowly past on the avenue without turning into the station and continued straight. I waited until it completely disappeared before leaving the station. My hands were sweaty on the steering wheel, and all I could think about was the message asking me to go behind the house. If I had obeyed, I would have parked behind it, out of view from the main street with walls on both sides and no direct lighting. I wouldn't have seen that second car. I wouldn't have had an easy escape route. The more I thought about it, the clearer it seemed coordinated. A request to position me at a specific spot and another vehicle already present in the area. It didn't feel improvised. It felt like a test. When I finally got home, still with my heart racing, I opened the app to check the order details. The history showed that the customer's account had been created that same night. A few hours later, I received an automatic notification from the app saying the account had been deactivated for suspicious activity. I have never accepted an order on that street again. What bothers me the most isn't just the empty house or the car without plates. It's the feeling that I wasn't chosen randomly. I was available at that hour, in that area, alone. The system shows customers who is nearby, and someone that night used that, not to receive food.
Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.